Section 2. First Impressions. The stranger is in the parlour, and Mrs. Hall hovers uneasily. A timely visit from Teddy Henfrey leads to a few more revelations, but nothing makes Mrs. Hall feel easier in her mind. And then, the next day, the mystery only deepens. At 4 o'clock, when it was fairly dark and Mrs. Hall was screwing up her courage to go in and ask her visitor if he would take some tea, Teddy Henfrey, the clock jobber, came into the bar.
"My sakes, Mrs. Hall,"
said he,
"but this is terrible weather for thin boots."
the snow outside was falling faster. Mrs. Hall agreed with him, and then noticed he had his bag and hit upon a brilliant idea. "Now you are here, Mr. Teddy," said she. "I would be glad if you gave the old clock in the parlour a bit of a look. It is going, and it strikes well and hearty, but the hour hand won't do nothing but point at 6. And leading the way, she went across to the parlour door and rapped and entered. Her visitor, she saw as she opened the door, was seated in the armchair before the fire, dozing it would seem, with his bandaged head drooping on one side. The only light in the room was the red glow from the fire, which lit his eyes like adverse railway signals, but left his downcast face in darkness, and the scanty vertiges of the day that came in through the open door. Everything was ruddy, shadowy, and indistinct to her, the more so since she had just been lighting the bar lamp, and her eyes were dazzled. But for a second it seemed to her that the man she looked at had an enormous mouth wide open, a vast and incredible mouth that swallowed the whole of the lower portion of his face. It was the sensation of a moment, the wide-bound head, the monstrous goggle eyes, and this huge yawn below it. Then he started up in his chair, put up his hand. She opened the door wide, so that the room was lighter, and she saw him more clearly, with the muffler held to his face, just as she had seen him hold the serviette before. The shadows, she fancied, had tricked her. "Would you mind, sir? This man a-coming to look at the clock, sir?" she said, recovering from her momentary shock.
"Look at the clock?"
he said, staring round in a drowsy manner and speaking over his hand, and then getting more fully awake.
"Certainly."
Mrs. Hall went away to get a lamp, and he rose and stretched himself. Then came the light, and Mr. Teddy Henfrey, entering, was confronted by this bandaged person. He was, he says,
taken aback. "Good afternoon,"
said the stranger, regarding him, as Mr. Henfrey says with a vivid sense of the dark spectacles.
"Like a lobster. I hope,"
said Mr. Henfrey.
"that it's no intrusion." "None whatever,"
said the stranger.
"though I understand,"
he said, turning to Mrs. Hall,
"that this room is really to be mine for my own private use."
"I thought, sir," said Mrs. Hall, "you would prefer the clock." She was going to say mended.
"Certainly,"
said the stranger.
"Certainly. But as a rule, I like to be alone and undisturbed. But I'm really glad to have the clock seen to,"
he said, seeing a certain hesitation in Mr. Henfrey's manner.
"Very glad."
Mr. Henfrey had intended to apologize and withdraw, but this anticipation reassured him. The stranger stood round with his back to the fireplace and put his hands behind his back.
"And presently,"
he said,
"when the clock mending is over, I think I should like to have some tea, but not till the clock mending is over."
Mrs. Hall was about to leave the room. She made no conversational advances this time, because she did not want to be snubbed in front of Mr. Henfrey, when her visitor asked her if she had made any arrangements about his boxes at Bramblehurst. She told him she had mentioned the matter to the postman, and that the carrier could bring them over on the morrow.
"You are certain that is the earliest?"
he said. She was certain with a marked coldness.
"I should explain,"
he added,
"what I was really too cold and fatigued to do before, that I am an experimental investigator."
"Indeed, sir," said Mrs. Hall, much impressed.
"And my baggage contains apparatus and appliances."
"Very useful things indeed they are, sir," said Mrs. Hall.
"And am naturally anxious to get on with my inquiries.
"Of course, sir,"
My reason for coming to Iping
he proceeded with a certain deliberation of manner,
was a desire for solitude. I do not wish to be disturbed in my work. In addition to my work, an accident—"
"I thought as much," said Mrs. Hall to herself.
necessitates a certain retirement. My eyes are sometimes so weak and painful that I have to shut myself up in the dark for hours together. Lock myself up, sometimes now and then. Not at present, certainly. At such times, the slightest disturbance, the entry of a stranger into the room, is a source of excruciating annoyance to me. It is well these things should be understood."
"Certainly, sir," said Mrs. Hall, "and if I might make so bold as to ask—"
"That, I think, is all,"
said the stranger, with that quietly irresistible air of finality he could assume at will. Mrs. Hall reserved her question and sympathy for a better occasion. After Mrs. Hall had left the room, he remained standing in front of the fire, glaring, so Mr. Henfrey puts it, at the clock mending. Mr. Henfrey not only took off the hands of the clock and the face, but extracted the works. He tried to work in as slow and quiet and unassuming a manner as possible. He worked with the lamp close to him, and the green shade threw a brilliant light upon his hands and upon the frame and wheels, and left the rest of the room shadowy. When he looked up, coloured patches swam in his eyes. Being constitutionally of a curious nature, he had removed the works, a quite unnecessary proceeding, with the idea of delaying his departure and perhaps falling into conversation with the stranger. But the stranger stood there, perfectly silent and still. So still, it got on Henfrey's nerves. He felt alone in the room and looked up, and there, grey and dim, were the bandaged head and huge blue lenses staring fixedly, with a mist of green spots drifting in front of them. It was so uncanny looking to Henfrey that for a minute they remained staring blankly at one another. Then Henfrey looked down again. Very uncomfortable position. One would like to say something. Should he remark that the weather was very cold for the time of the year? He looked up as if to take aim with that introductory shot.
"The weather?"
he began.
"Why don't you finish and go?"
said the rigid figure, evidently in a state of painfully suppressed rage.
"All you've got to do is to fix the hour hand on its axle. You're simply humbugging." "Certainly, sir. 1 minute more, sir. I overlooked."
And Mr. Henfrey finished and went. But he went off feeling excessively annoyed.
"Damn it!"
said Mr. Henfrey to himself, trudging down the village through the thawing snow.
"A man must do a clock at times, surely. And again, can't a man look at you? Ugly."
And yet again.
"Seemingly not. If the police was wanting you, you couldn't be more wrapped and bandaged."
At Gleason's corner he saw Hall, who had recently married the stranger's hostess and the coach and horses, and who now drove the Iping conveyance when occasional people required it, to Cider Bridge Junction, coming towards him on his return from that place. Hall had evidently been stopping a bit at Cider Bridge to judge by his driving.
"How do, Teddy?"
he said, passing.
"You got a rum and a poem?"
said Teddy. Hall very sociably pulled up.
"What's that?"
he asked.
"Rum-looking customer stopping at the Coach and Horses,"
said Teddy.
"My sakes!"
And he proceeded to give Hall a vivid description of his Grosticue guest.
"Looks a bit like a disguise, don't it? I'd like to see a man's face if I had him stopping in my place,"
said Henry.
"But women are that trustful where strangers are concerned. He's took your rooms, and he ain't even given a name, Hall." "You don't say so,"
said Hall, who was a man of sluggish apprehension.
"Yes,"
said Teddy.
"by the week, whatever he is, you can't get rid of him under the week. And he's got a lot of luggage coming tomorrow, so he says. Let's hope it won't be stones and boxes, Hall."
He told Hall how his aunt at Hastings had been swindled by a stranger with empty portmanteaus. Altogether, he left Hall vaguely suspicious.
"Get up, old girl,"
said Hall.
"I suppose I must see about this."
Teddy trudged on his way with his mind considerably relieved. Instead of seeing about it, however, Hall on his return was severely rated by his wife on the length of time he had spent in Cider Bridge, and his mild inquiries were answered snappishly and in a manner not to the point. But the seed of suspicion Teddy had sown germinated in the mind of Mr. Hall in spite of these discouragements.
"You whim don't know everything,"
said Mr. Hall, resolved to ascertain more about the personality of his guest at the earliest possible opportunity. And after the stranger had gone to bed, which he did about 9:30, Mr. Hall went very aggressively into the parlour and looked very hard at his wife's furniture, just to show that the stranger wasn't master there, and scrutinized closely and a little contemptuously a sheet of mathematical computation the stranger had left. When retiring for the night, he instructed Mrs. Hall to look very closely at the stranger's luggage when it came the next day. "You mind your own business, Hall," said Mrs. Hall, "and I'll mind mine." She was all the more inclined to snap at Hall because the stranger was undoubtedly an unusually strange sort of stranger, and she was by no means assured about him in her own mind. In the middle of the night, she woke up dreaming of huge white heads like turnips that came trailing after her at the end of the interminable necks and with vast black eyes. But being a sensible woman, she subdued her terrors and turned over and went to sleep again. So it was that on the 29th day of February, at the beginning of the thaw, this singular person fell out of infinity into Iping village. Next day his luggage arrived through the slush, and very remarkable luggage it was. There were a couple of trunks indeed, such as a rational man might need, but in addition there were a box of books, big, fat books, of which some were just in an incomprehensible handwriting, and a dozen or more crates, boxes, and cases containing objects packed in straw, as it seemed to Hall, tugging with a casual curiosity at the straw glass bottles. The stranger, muffled in hat, coat, gloves, and wrapper, came out impatiently to meet Farenside's cart, while Hall was having a word or so of gossip preparatory to helping bring them in. Out he came, not noticing Farenside's dog, who was sniffing in a delante spirit at Hall's legs.
"Come along with those boxes,"
he said.
"I've been waiting long enough."
and he came down the steps towards the tail of the cart as if to lay hands on the smaller crate. Mr. Hall, staring at them from the steps and listening, found it incredible that he had seen anything so very remarkable happen upstairs. Besides, his vocabulary was altogether too limited to express his impressions.
"He don't want no help," he says,
he said in answer to his wife's inquiry.
"We'd better be a-taking of his luggage in." "Come along!"
cried an angry voice in the doorway, and there stood the muffled stranger with his collar turned up and his hat brim bent down.
"The sooner you get those things in, the better I'll be pleased."
Directly the first crate was, in accordance with his directions, carried into the parlour. The stranger flung himself upon it with extraordinary eagerness and began to unpack it, scattering the straw with an utter disregard of Mrs. Hall's carpet, and from it he began to produce bottles, little fat bottles containing powders, small and slender bottles containing coloured and white fluids, fluted blue bottles labelled poison, bottles with round bodies and slender necks, large green glass bottles, large white glass bottles, bottles with glass toppers and frosted labels, bottles with fine corks, bottles with bungs, bottles with wooden caps, wine bottles, salad oil bottles, putting them in rows on the chiffonier, on the mantel, on the table, under the window, round the floor, on the bookshelf, everywhere. The chemist's shop is Bramblehurst could not boast half so many. Quite a sight it was. Crate after crate yielded bottles until all 6 were empty and the table high with straw. The only things that came out of these crates besides the bottles were a number of test tubes and a carefully packed balance. And directly the crates were unpacked, the stranger went to the window and set to work, not troubling in the least about the litter of straw, the fire which had gone out, the box of books outside, nor for the trunks and other luggage that had gone upstairs. When Mrs. Hall took his dinner into him, he was already so absorbed in his work, pouring little drops out of the bottles into test tubes, that he did not hear her until she had swept away the bulk of the straw and put the tray on the table, with some little emphasis perhaps, seeing the state that the floor was in. Then he half turned his head and immediately turned it away again, but she saw he had removed his glasses. They were beside him on the table, and it seemed to her that his eye sockets were extraordinarily hollow. He put on his spectacles again, and then turned and faced her. She was about to complain of the straw on the floor when he anticipated her.
"I wish you wouldn't come in without knocking,"
he said in the tone of abnormal exasperation that seemed so characteristic of him. "I knocked, but seemingly—"
"Perhaps you did, but in my investigations, my really very urgent and necessary investigations, the slightest disturbance, the jar of a door, I must ask you."
"Certainly, sir. You can turn the lock if you are like that. You know, any time."
"A very good idea,"
said the stranger. "This straw, sir, if I might make so bold as to remark."
"Don't. If the straw makes trouble, put it down in the bill."
And he mumbled at her words suspiciously like curses. He was so odd, standing there, so aggressive and explosive, bottle in one hand and test tube in the other, that Mrs. Hall was quite alarmed. But she was a resolute woman. "In which case, I should like to know, sir, what you consider."
"A shilling. Put down a shilling. Surely a shilling's enough."
"So be it," said Mrs. Hall, taking up the tablecloth and beginning to spread it over the table.
"If you're satisfied, of course."
He turned and sat down with his coat collar towards her. All the afternoon he worked with the door locked and, as Mrs. Hall testifies, for the most part in silence. But once there was a concussion and a sound of bottles ringing together as though the table had been hit, and the smash of a bottle flung violently down, and then a rapid pacing athwart the room. Fearing something was the matter, she went to the door and listened, not caring to knock.
I can't go on.
He was raving.
I can't go on. 300,000, 400,000, the huge multitude, cheated. All my life it may take me. Patience, patience indeed. Fool and liar.
There was a noise of hobnails on the bricks in the bar, and Mrs. Hall had very reluctantly to leave the rest of his soliloquy. When she returned, the room was silent again, save for the faint crepitation for his chair and the occasional clink of the bottle. It was all over. The stranger had resumed work. When she took in his tea, she saw broken glass in the corner of the room under the concave mirror, and a gold stain that had been carelessly wiped. She called attention to it.
Put it down in the bill,
Snapped her visitor.
for God's sake. Don't worry about me. If there's damage done, put it down in the bill.
And he went on ticking a list in the exercise book before him.
An extract from The Invisible Man by H.G. Wells. H.G. Wells, 1866 to 1946, was a British writer. He wrote more than 50 novels and dozens of short stories. He is best remembered for his science fiction novels and has been called the father of science fiction.
Section 3. When I Heard the Learned Astronomer. In this 1865 poem, the poet subtly conveys his belief that science has its limits. When it comes to understanding the world, nature has to be experienced to be truly understood. When I heard the learned astronomer, when the proofs, the figures were ranged in columns before me, when I was shown the charts and diagrams to add, divide, and measure them, when I, sitting, heard the astronomer where he lectured with much applause in the lecture room, how soon unaccountable I became tired and sick, till rising and gliding out, I wandered off by myself in the mystical moist night air, and from time to time looked up in perfect silence at the stars.